Is there should I just get started, or is there anything we need to cover ahead of time?
Nope. Fire away.
Okay. So my name is Schmitz. I'm Purdue Extension educator in Posey County. Um, I've been a Purdue Extension educator for nearly 12 years now, and I've been in multiple counties along the way. Happy to be speaking with you today. This has been an interesting year as far as being a master gardener, being an extension educator, you name it goes. But what I wanted to focus on today is basically, I don't know about Andrew, but I'm not getting quite as many calls as I would in a normal year. And we're not allowed to do quite as much as we would in a normal year. But that said, there are always some pests, diseases, insects, you name it, that pop up repeatedly over time. And this is kind of the short list of what I've seen in 2020 from emails I've received, calls I've received, walking around my yard, which I'm doing a whole lot more than I used to. So with that, I'll go ahead and get started. Hope I don't take the whole hour, and if you see something, you've just got to chime in. Please do. Andrew's the co-host, so I'll just start talking and stop talking when I hear someone else talking. So every year is unique, and we have seen some interesting things this year that we wouldn't see any other year. That said, the Indiana Department of Natural Resources, Division of Entomology and Plant Pathology, keeps a pretty good track of things that they're seeing out in the field. And they send weekly emails out to those that subscribe to their listserv on things that they're seeing. And if I'm seeing it and they're seeing it, it made this presentation. If you want to reach out to the DNR for any reason, and one of the biggest reasons that Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology you would want to reach out is a new invasive species is found. When we were still pretty closely tracking the emerald ash borer, DEPP was kind of the confirming agency. So the fines in Posey, Gibson, and the area were all confirmed by Angela Rust. Her cell and email is here. She's based out of Tell City. So she's a great resource for everybody. But of course, Purdue Extension knows how to reach out to her as well. So if you want to get a hold of us, we can get you in touch with the right person. First thing I wanted to cover is a couple non-pests. I get some calls and we're concerned because there are ants and they're near a woody species. Ants are not the pest. They do tend to make homes and travel quite a bit when there is problems that exist. There are problems that exist. So a lot of times with damage to tree trunks near the base, ants will set up shop and people will suspect that the ants were the cause of the problem. Not the case, but they are a sign that there could be something there. Likewise, we'll talk about aphids, leafhoppers a little bit later, and wherein those are pretty thick, ants will come in and try to feed there. So you might see an infestation, but not a pest. Likewise, we talk about sapsuckers and woodpeckers. This is a pileated woodpecker, which they do exist around here, but they're not the most common type. If you've ever heard one, you remember it. They make a very distinct sound. But those are not the pests. They are a sign that you've got an insect infestation in a tree that the woodpeckers can then feed on, and they are a harbinger of sorrow for tree species. Wherein you do see woodpeckers, that tree is usually on its way out within a couple of years. As an extension educator diagnosing plant issues. I have always had and will always have, the most issues with evergreen species, with conifers. Basically, the Department of Entomology and Plant Pathology put in last week's these 3 pictures, 2 of which are root rot, 1 of which is winter injury. And to me, the differentiation between these is incredibly difficult. Probably the hardest call I've ever received as an extension educator was to the Christmas tree farm in Oakland City to come out and start identifying species and seeing what was wrong with problem plants in the landscape. I could have spent hundreds of dollars sending specimens up to the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab, because evergreens, with the needling and the general dieback, it's hard to distinguish differences without some form of microscopic imagery or the ability to do PCR analysis. So as a further example, more pictures that were in last week's DEPP newsletter. Photo 20 here on the left, a parasitized pine needle scale. I had never heard of that until last week. And as you can see, if I were looking at that, it would be very difficult to distinguish exactly what's going on there. You look at aphid damage on a Fraser fir, that doesn't look that dissimilar from the last slide. However, particularly with aphids, you do have the opportunity to do something similar to what you would do for a 2-spotted spider mite, and get out your white piece of paper, shake the tree a little bit, and see if anything moves on the paper. So when in doubt, when we're having a difficult diagnosis, just a reminder, we can submit images to the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory. And in my experience with the ability to submit a digital image, I prefer to do that first. It's non-injurious to the plant. You're not having to take plant portions and send them up to campus. And if you pay $11 for the digital image to be diagnosed and they can't diagnose it with images, then they'll tell you to go ahead and send a sample up to campus, but they won't charge you any more. It's $11 until they get it diagnosed. So I had a ewe 3 years ago probably, and we could not get it figured out with images. So we took a sample and sent it up, and then we ended up having to dig a whole plant after that and send it up. And sure enough, Larry Kaplan had told me, ewes don't like wet feet, and this happened to be a site that was a little bit wetter than it should have been, and that ended up being the diagnosis. It took us soil samples to get there, 3 different contacts with the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory, a couple of months, but it was still only $11 in the end. The one thing that you see on sycamores relatively commonly is anthracnose, but you don't see it to the scale that we're seeing it this year. Most sycamores in this neck of the woods seem to have at least a little bit of anthracnose on them somewhere, usually lower branches. And this is a disease that does lead to some concerning symptoms as far as the dieback is concerned. But like any other anthracnose on a tree, you leave it alone. Maybe you get rid of the debris when it falls. The tree is going to be fine. It's going to leaf out the next year, no problem. With sycamore anthracnose, when we get a cold or cooler spring, it tends to be more of an issue. And this year we did go straight from early spring into summer. So first year we've had that in a while. So this is popping up and looking more concerning than it might actually be. If you're going out and trying to diagnose, this is the kind of symptom that you're looking for. Obviously, if we go back and take a look at these dead leaves, that's kind of hard to tell what's going on there. You look at the way the leaves are curled up, growth regulator herbicide injury looks similar to that. But when you see the veinal chlorosis and necrosis here, that's a pretty sure sign, along with seeing some dead leaves, that we're dealing with sycamore anthracnose. This is new. I've never dealt with this until this year, and I've dealt with it multiple times this year. Ambrosia beetles have been causing some damage, and it depends on your history as to what this indicative sign looks like. You see the little spikelets coming out of the trunk there, and that is beetle frass. And it is either going to look like toothpicks or cigarette ash or something along that line. It will fall off fairly easily, and the beetles do come in and infest that plant, that tree. They have a wide host range species. So the two that I got calls on, one was a hickory and one was an elm or a maple. So pretty wide host range there. And it's a wide host range because they're not actually feeding on the tree. We know insects tend to have small host ranges when they're actually feeding on the tree. These are causing damage to the tree only in that the holes are being bored to lay eggs. And then there's a preferential fungus that comes in, and the larvae are feeding on that fungus. So they're not actually feeding on the tree at any point. That said, they love stressed trees. So wherein there's been some other damage in the past, they will come in and can essentially finish off that tree with all the damage to the cambium from the holes. Pests, mosquitoes are always a pest. I throw this up here just to highlight that West Nile virus is a thing that does exist in this neck of the woods. And if we look at the 2020 map thus far, we've found it in Arkansas. So it won't be too much longer till we'll find something a little bit further up the Ohio River, Mississippi to the Ohio River Valley. Something to ensure that we're trying to avoid any standing water in our landscape. The DNR reported tulip tree scale, and I have not received any calls yet on that this year, but I'll never forget the first time I did get a call that ended up being tulip tree scale. It was either the summer of 2012 or 2013. And I went out to a very scenic house that overlooked a lake, and there were tulip trees all around this lake, and it was raining on a sunny day. And that was actually the call I got, because actually they were playing on the fact that I'm a meteorologist from training, and this was a meteorological anomaly. This should not be happening. Why don't I come out and take a look? So I did, and we saw some of this. I scraped it off, got to looking at it. It was tulip tree scale, and wherein the tulip tree scale becomes rather broad spread, the honeydew that comes off the scale will drip down from the branches, and wherein it's got no trunk to drip, it will fall on the grass or the vehicle parked underneath it or the person standing underneath it thinking it's raining when it's actually insect pooping on them, stuff like that. So if we see that again, it'll be pretty interesting. But since that 2012-2013 rash of scale calls, there has been residual scale in the area, and there has been a call or two a year, I would say, at least in my office. Aphids and leafhoppers, alfalfa earlier this spring was particularly infested. early, and before the first cutting of that crop could be made, there was a lot of damage from these small insects. So I anticipate that we're going to see that continue on other plants this year. Aphids and leaf hoppers are different species, but of course can look very similar and can show similar damage. In this case, you're seeing aphid damage, and wherein that gets severe, you'll see the cupping of the leaves, you'll see ants start to come in and feed on the honeydew and the other typical signs. Okay. Of the agricultural chemicals that are used on corn and soybean, dicamba is the #1 soybean herbicide in this area. And late last week, we heard that a district court had removed the registrations on 3 of the 4 dicamba products that are used. So this should be the last year we have widespread issues with dicamba drift. And after June 20th, those agricultural dicamba products are not allowed to be sprayed. So, with the knowledge that the registrations have been pulled, farmers are still allowed to use the product until June 20th, and they may not be able to use the product in following years. The next 10 days are going to see widespread nationwide dicamba usage on a scale that we've never seen before. So, because of that, it's worthy to know what drift looks like. And you see 2 images here of what growth regulator herbicide drift looks like. 2,4-D damage and dicamba damage are very hard to tell apart. Almost have to be sent to a lab. Species by species, there are very distinct differences that a trained spotter would be able to know. But in the landscape, for us, for you, pretty hard to tell the difference. But wherein you do see the growth regulator damage, you see the twisting, you see the cupping, you see the variegation, witch's brooming, those symptomologies, particularly on new growth. It's been a bit of mechanical injury, and probably be a bit more this year. Pretty typical to get some mechanical injury every year. And usually we're getting that by running the string trimmer or the mower a little too close to our woody plants. Maybe we're using a chemical a little too close to susceptible plants. Maybe we're pruning improperly. Multiple pruning calls this year, and just the way the year went, I know that we seemed to have a little bit of early start to growth before it got cool again. So our pruning window might have been a little more restricted than we would normally think. So important to wait until late winter to prune on anything that doesn't flower out in the spring. And then if we have a spring flowering plant, we wait until that's done flowering, and as soon as we can, we go ahead and prune there. This is relatively new. I know Andrew's one of the people that put it on the map here, but I'm doing an article for Gibson and Posey newspapers this week because the number of calls that Megan Ritter's camp has received, the Posey County Soil and Water Conservation District have received, and I have received this year is 2 to 3 times what it has been. And it's been over a year since we've really advertised that we need to be looking for this. So people have had time to forget, and they have not, which means that we've definitely got an issue with this around. The Purdue Landscape Report last week put out an article that contained the difference between the common earthworm and jumping worm here, and said to be on the lookout for it, which is good. The DNR has not positively identified it yet. However, we are trying to get samples wherever we can, flood Purdue and the DNR, and force them to tell us that it does exist, because we're pretty sure we found it multiple places. Major distinguishing signs you see there: the clitellum, which is the band, is whitish. It is relatively close to the head. It is smooth, and the worm is dry-ish. Interesting telltale between the earthworm, which is rather slimy, and the jumping worm, which is drier. Oh, this little guy's still alive. Let's see if you can really see. We've got, there. You can see the clitellum, maybe, if I hold it right. And that is very close to the head. And this has been laying on my desk waiting for me to send it up for, 4 or 5 days.
We can only see your slide.
Oh! All right. Any better? If I'm talking, I should be somewhat highlighted, right? It moves a lot, and you've got the band pretty close to the head when knowing that it's a rather long insect. Okay, so
Hans, there were a couple of questions in the chat. If you wanted to,
let's handle it before we move over. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So the first question, do you want me to go ahead and would that be helpful if I read them?
It would be, yes. Thank you very much.
So the first question was, will the dicamba decision impact products where it is one of the ingredients?
So in this case, the dicamba decision will affect Ingenia, Fexapan, and Extendamax. If you're using a different formulation than those three, it is not affected, and you still will be able to use it. So all of the horticultural use products that would have dicamba, still on the market, no effect whatsoever.
Okay, great. Jumping worm, is it okay for fishing?
It is sold as a fishing worm under the name Alabama jumper. And in this neck of the woods, all the reports are, compared to other worms, it's horrible. It moves around too much. It's too hard to get on a hook. It moves around so much that the fish don't like it. If you go to the southeast Alabama, it gets a little bit better reputation there. But we don't have Purdue research on this, but every anecdotal report I've heard is there are better options for fishing in this neck of the woods.
Okay, that's all the questions for now.
Okay. So those were the species that I wanted to cover today. We're still pretty early in the year, so expecting to see more as the year goes on. What's to come depends a lot on what we experience with the weather. We certainly have different types of pests, like spider mites that only pop up when we get droughty, versus types that pop up when we get rather wet, powdery mildew, let's say. So if we look at the June, July, and August Climate Prediction Center map, we've got equal chances on temperature and a little bit above average chances on precipitation. I have to qualify these slides every time I give it that equal chances means 33 1/3% chance of above average temperature in this case, 33 1/3% chance of average temperature, 33 1/3% chance of below average temperature, and that 0.1% chance that all hell breaks loose. So on the precipitation side, it's a good thing to see that we're predicted to be a little bit above average. That would be nice if it does play out. What you see with these maps is not a strong signal from the El Nino Southern Oscillation. What does appear to be signaling the meteorologists and climatologists that make these maps is more of a synoptic scale flow. And I know I'm going to have to go into a little detail on that, but basically the above average temperature and precipitation in Alaska and the way that we end up above average on precipitation means the jet stream is going to be the king. So wherein you do see these cold, low pressure systems running through the United States, they tend to come up over the Rockies in Canada and then arch back down into our neck of the woods a little bit north of us, actually, during the summertime. And this is pretty indicative of that being the major driver of precipitation through the summer months. So hopefully that does play out. Here in Indiana, we get our precipitation three ways. One is how we got it earlier today, which is something coming up from the tropics, a tropical storm or something like that. One are mesoscale convective complexes, which are pop-up thunder showers during the course of a hot day. And the third and most prevalent are those synoptic scale low pressure systems that make their way across the US. So wherein we're predicted to have above normal rainfall, and it is because of the number one way that we should get rainfall, that's a great sign. So I'm actually hopeful, based on these climate maps, that we'll have a pretty decent year. I'm glad to see us fall into equal chances on temperature, because there isn't a whole lot of the United States that does. And it's kind of sad to see the Four Corners with that highly, highly above average chance, because they do tend to go into pretty severe drought conditions regularly anyway. With that, I would be remiss if I didn't bring up one of the apocalyptic events of 2020, and that was the discovery of the murder hornets in Washington State and in British Columbia. They have only been found in Washington State and British Columbia. And what is actually good about not being able to get out is that people aren't traveling as much. The opportunity for those hornets to stow away in transport has been more limited this year than in other years, which means those murder hornets are probably sticking around Washington State and British Columbia this year at least. I did get quite a few calls on potential just wasps that needed to be identified. Virtually all of those were European hornets. There was a cicada killer brought up from Florida. Somebody went on vacation and accidentally packed it away with them on the way back. But if we do see Asian giant hornets on the east side of the Rockies, it's going to be because somebody went to the west side of the Rockies and it managed to make it back with them. So, conclusions, including new information that I haven't even covered yet, but why not throw it in the conclusions anyway? Something new is going to pop up every year. In this case, the Asian giant hornet and the prevalence of that sycamore anthracnose. Something old pops up every year. We see a little bit of tulip tree scale every year. We see a little bit of mosquitoes and mechanical injury, other things. Experience in seeing it and going through the process of diagnosing it helps tremendously the next time you come around something like this. If you are a person who uses search engines quite a bit, if you put what's in quotations there, cite : edu, after your search, it will only return sites that are .edu sites. And I found that to be very helpful in avoiding some blog posts and other things that are less reputable when trying to figure out what's going on. And the Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Laboratory never shut down for coronavirus considerations. They remained open for business. They're still open for business. Submitting a digital sample is probably how you want to start, and then let them advise you on the best manner to proceed from there. So that said, I know I've left plenty of time for questions, and I think if we do end in less than an hour, Andrew might still give you a whole hour of that education time.
Absolutely. I think I went through and muted everyone, so if you have a question, just be sure to unmute yourself.
If you find one of the Asian jumping worms, should you kill it?
If you're not going to hold on to it to give to one of us to send up the chain, yes. It's generally detrimental, particularly in a forest ecosystem. It decreases the amount of organic matter in the soil surface because that's its food. So generally speaking, it creates a pretty negative consequence for the environment in which it exists. And there is research to state that wherein you have some jumping worms and some earthworms, over time the jumping worms outcompete the earthworms and end up taking away your better fishing bait, replacing it with worse.
I've seen several in my yard.
If you can get 2 or 3 and get them in a container with a little bit of food to help them survive for a while, and get it to one of us, that'd be great. And then kill the rest of them if you can.
Okay.
If she's found several in her yard, will there not be many more? Likely?
Yeah, likely there will be more. It somewhat depends on the amount of organic matter in the soil. So if they're in a yard, a thick thatch layer is really going to help these worms out, and could be a lot of potential there. The one I was holding up was identified in a load of mulch that was taken from a local tree trimming company. So mulch, thatch, forest environment with a lot of leaf litter, all potential for high infestations there. If you don't have those things, not as high a potential for infestation. You might just have 1 or 2 pop up.
Is this another example of an Asian insect, not insect, but an Asian life that's been brought here that has no control?
No natural predators, correct.
Mm-hmm. How does this worm affect our gardens, our garden environment?
Sure. So wherein you have a garden, you value organic matter for the nutrient cycling it provides, and this worm decreases the amount of organic matter in your garden, so that's a bad thing. Wherein you have a garden and you're using cover crops, which is a great thing. You're creating better potential for overwintering and more green manure in the end for it to feed on. So that's a mitigating effect as well. That said, tilling the soil to death is not going to help in this case. It will find either a nearby location to hang out at until it's got some leaf litter to work on, or it's got the potential to get into the soil a little bit, get out of the depth of tilling equipment.
Hans, is this another case for fighting a losing battle?
In this case, what we're fighting is recognition that we're a state with a problem. At this point in time, there's no official recognition of Indiana as a state that has a jumping worm problem, and we'd like to, even if it is a losing battle, at least announce that there was a battle.
One bit of humor, do robins know the difference?
I don't know.
We can hope they don't.
Right.
Hans, last year we had tomato blight. Are we going to have that again this year?
If we keep the prediction of above average precipitation, I would expect to see septoria leaf spot and early blight be issues in the landscape, particularly in gardens where you've seen it before. But if we turn off a little bit dry, they won't be as big of an issue. If we do turn off dry, we have a better potential for that kind of delayed onset of fruit that we've experienced the last couple of years, where we just got too high of temperatures at night in the summertime, and the plant stalled out in actually ripening up the fruit. So if we can keep above average precipitation, that does tend to mitigate temperatures just a touch. So hopefully, I'd like to see a normal year once where when the fruit is green, it actually turns red in a reasonable amount of time.
I'm with you.
Now, Hans, I've been around in Master Gardener, this is Dennis Slow, for quite a while. And it seems like we've been battling Asian life for quite a while, whether it be in plants, insects, and now in worms. I guess they really just don't belong here.
Correct, and the same goes opposite ways, wherein you see a North American relatively minor pest pop up in Asia, it becomes a big concern in a hurry. Just the fact that we have more transport between Asiatic countries and North American countries than we ever have in the past creates ways for pests to get back and forth. I do see in the chat, should we try some poison for the jumping worms? And the answer to that is not really the best way to get rid of jumping worms. There's a concoction that'll bring them to the surface. It involves garlic. Help me out, Andrew, or I saw June was on the phone.
Yeah, I forget. Yeah, they tried it at the Soil and Water District, and I believe it. Yeah, it's common household ingredients. I think it was some kind of garlic mixture, but yeah, it brings them to the surface right away.
And from there, it's more or less shovel or hand or, manual labor. ticks in our area this year. So we have seen over time, over many years, the spread of some species of ticks out of the Northeast United States, kind of into the Midwest. We've also seen some spread from Texas and in the Southeast up into our neck of the woods. I won't make a solid prediction for the tick population in this area this year. But if we look at trends over time, they have increased. And if we look at a trend into the future, I would predict them to increase as well, with each individual year being a variable there. Buffalo gnats, and which are black flies, it's not too early for their appearance. It feels like it's too early, but it's June, and last year we actually ended up with about 2 different generations of black fly buffalo gnats. One a little bit earlier in the summer, and then one later on. So it's on the early side, but it's not unreasonably early for those insects to be popping up.
All right. Anyone have any other questions for Hans? As usual, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to contact Hans or myself, and we will do our best to get you an answer.
Good program tonight.
Thank you.
Thanks, Hans.
Thank you.
Yeah, good program. Thank you.
Yeah. Enjoyed.
Hans, what's your email address?
Let me throw my contact information back up on the screen again. Maybe that'll help.
Thank you.
The @ is my Twitter handle. I don't have Instagram.